On December 18, 1878, in the town of Gori, deep in Georgia, a son was born to the family of shoemaker Vissarion Djugashvili and his wife Ekaterina. The first two children in the family died in infancy. The boy was eagerly awaited and was named Joseph. As often happens, later generations tried to find in the young son of the shoemaker Djugashvili those qualities that would eventually make him the famous General Secretary Stalin. But we find nothing of the sort in his childhood. His parents were literate. His father could communicate in several languages. Not an extraordinary level of education, but a respectable one. The shoemaker was certainly not a millionaire, but his trade provided for his wife and son. Later, his father became an alcoholic and left the family. But Ekaterina became a sought-after seamstress. Little Joseph was sometimes beaten, but in the 19th century, this was a standard method of upbringing. In short, the Djugashvili family did not live particularly well, but they lived reasonably comfortably. Young Stalin suffered from physical defects, but these were not a life sentence. His face permanently bore the marks of smallpox contracted in childhood, and his left arm was atrophied and functioned poorly for the rest of his life. At the age of 6, the boy was struck by a carriage. All of this, however, was compensated for by his intellectual abilities. The boy was intelligent, and Ekaterina Djugashvili did everything she could to open a path in life for him. The family's connections were not impressive, but thanks to an acquaintance who was a priest, Joseph improved his Russian and was able to enter a religious school. There was just enough money to pay for it. As a result, Joseph studied with exceptional diligence. Difficulties in his studies, or even the loss of his scholarship, would have ruined his future prospects. He graduated with excellent grades and moved on to the Tiflis Seminary with a solid foundation in theology, including 3 languages: his native Georgian, Russian, and Greek. At that time, he showed no revolutionary tendencies whatsoever and was generally considered a model young man. The same was true in the seminary. Up to a certain point, Djugashvili was an exemplary student, but soon something changed. Paradoxically, seminaries of that era were breeding grounds for revolutionary ideology. The state had little interest in religion. The social status of priests was low. These institutions were, in many ways, vocational schools. Seminarians often came from poor and troubled families. Studying was difficult. Barrack-style discipline, punishments, and searches. Seminarians often came from poor and troubled families. Studying was difficult. Barrack-style discipline, punishments, and searches. It was from secular literature that Joseph found some of his inspirations. He was attracted to romantic adventure novels. From Alexander Kazbegi's novel The Patricide, he adopted the image of the noble outlaw Koba, whose name he later took as his pseudonym. At the same time, Joseph began writing poetry. The model boy became a romantic young man. But where there is romance, there is mystery. Djugashvili joined an underground book club. Seminarians secretly read ordinary secular books that were perfectly legal outside their educational institution. At first, Joseph was accused only of reading Victor Hugo. But soon, the young man became fascinated by more radical ideas. He immersed himself completely in Marxism. From 1898 onward, Joseph belonged to a social democratic circle and associated with revolutionaries. He simply failed to appear for an examination. But by then he had already found new friends. That same year, Joseph Djugashvili worked as an observer at the Tiflis Meteorological Observatory. It was the only legal job he ever held that was not connected to governing a state. He simply failed to appear for an examination. But by then he had already found new friends. That same year, Joseph Djugashvili worked as an observer at the Tiflis Meteorological Observatory. It was the only legal job he ever held that was not connected to governing a state. Of course, the work required no qualifications, but it solved the problem of food and shelter. At the same time, young Djugashvili was engaged in very different activities. He quickly gained a reputation as a radical, even among revolutionaries. After the seminary, he had personal grievances against the old world and wanted to destroy it as quickly as possible. He proposed not merely engaging in propaganda, but organizing strikes and working directly with laborers. All of this led to a break not merely with the seminary, but with the surrounding world. In 1900, he gave his first speech before a large gathering of revolutionary-minded workers. And 1901 changed everything. The police arrived at the observatory with a search warrant. Djugashvili was not there. He went underground. Koba turned out to be a natural conspirator. He organized propaganda among workers and managed to avoid arrest for quite a long time. He was finally captured after a major action. In 1902, he effectively organized mass unrest at the oil fields of Batumi, involving strikes, arson, assassination attempts, and gunfights. The climax came when a crowd attempted to storm a prison where arrested workers were being held. 13 people were killed. While under arrest, Djugashvili did not behave heroically. He tried to avoid responsibility, asked friends to help fabricate an alibi, and when the case dragged on, he began writing petitions for release. None of this worked, and Koba was exiled to Siberia. But in early 1904, he escaped. Siberian exile was no resort, but escapes were prevented mainly by natural conditions rather than guards, so prisoners escaped regularly. Djugashvili calmly returned to his native Georgia. His arrests only increased his prestige within the revolutionary underground. Around this time, Lenin split from the more moderate Mensheviks and took leadership of the Bolsheviks, the most radical wing of the revolutionary movement. Young Koba admired Vladimir Ilyich precisely for his decisiveness and uncompromising nature. The revolution of 1905 completely consumed Joseph, organizing combat groups, propaganda, living under forged documents. In short, the classic life of an underground revolutionary. However, ironically, Stalin's connection to the most famous event of his early biography was only indirect. On June 26, 1907, a group of Bolsheviks under the command of Simon Ter-Petrosyan carried out a notorious robbery in Tiflis. In broad daylight, armed militants carrying revolvers and grenades ambushed a treasury carriage transporting money from the post office to a bank. Observers, the assault team, and Ter-Petrosyan himself, disguised as an officer, operated with perfect precision. The carriage was bombed, and a firefight broke out with the guards. Ter-Petrosyan escaped with an enormous sum, up to 340,000 rubles. At the time, this was an immense fortune. Up to 50 people were wounded in the street, and at least 3 were killed. Djugashvili was often credited with direct participation in the raid, and even with being wounded. But today, we can say that this is a myth. He knew about the preparations, may have participated in planning, but most likely did not take part in the firefight personally. He did, however, help hide the stolen money. The money was sewn into a mattress, which Stalin carried to a familiar location, the meteorological observatory. Ter-Petrosyan was soon arrested with a large cache of weapons and an Austrian passport. He was sent to prison and later transferred to a psychiatric hospital. Djugashvili escaped, but in 1908 he was caught again and exiled to Vologda. In 1911, Joseph returned from exile and once again found himself underground. By then, he was a battle-hardened revolutionary, intelligent, angry, at least if one is to judge by the accounts of his comrades. He had now entered the circle of Bolshevik leaders. It was at that time that he adopted the pseudonym Stalin. There is a popular story that it was a Russified version of his real surname, and that Juga supposedly means steel in Georgian. But that is a myth, albeit an early one dating back to the revolutionary era. Juga is an ancient word, simply a name without any translation. The Georgian word for steel sounds completely different. Stalin's new pseudonym merely continued the fashion for harsh-sounding underground names, that referred to the workers' movement, such as Kamenev or Molotov. And of course, the new name attracted less attention in Central Russia and did not immediately identify its owner as a Georgian. Stalin now worked mainly in the capitals. He was constantly arrested and sent into exile in Vologda, and time after time he escaped. It resembled some kind of comedy sketch, but both the underground revolutionaries and the police treated it with complete seriousness. Between his travels from St. Petersburg and Moscow to the Vologda region, Stalin engaged in propaganda, organized newspaper publications, wrote political articles himself, and became increasingly immersed in the world of political intrigue. The former seminarian turned out to be a brave, resourceful, intelligent underground activist and a skilled orator. By 1913, it seemed that Stalin was building a career as the captain of a sinking ship. The government had saturated the radical movement with informants and was gradually crushing revolutionary groups. An enormous role in Stalin's fate was played by Roman Malinovsky, a revolutionary, a member of Lenin's party since 1906, a member of the Central Committee, and also an agent of the secret police. Malinovsky betrayed an entire generation of famous revolutionaries, including Bukharin, Orjonikidze, Sverdlov, and finally Stalin himself. Stalin was arrested in St. Petersburg. This time, exile to Vologda was not even considered. The government had finally grown tired of the radicals of the RSDLP. Joseph Jugashvili was sentenced to exile deep in Siberia, near Turukhansk. Escaping from there was far more difficult. Stalin was no longer a young man. He was already over 35. There he was in exile, without a penny to his name, in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by Siberian snow. Stalin wrote desperate letters to his friends, begging them not to forget him, but those pleas went unanswered. Stalin was no longer a young man. He was already over 35. There he was in exile, without a penny to his name, in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by Siberian snow. Stalin wrote desperate letters to his friends, begging them not to forget him, but those pleas went unanswered. The fact was that Stalin had one extremely unpleasant trait. He was incredibly untidy and absolutely hated doing household chores. Sverdlov wrote about it in restrained terms, but apparently the hut where the comrades lived together was a complete mess. In such conditions, arguments were practically inevitable. Eventually, Sverdlov even moved out. To survive, they hunted and fished. Stalin settled in the home of the orphaned Paraprigin family. Gradually, life improved. The police official supervising Stalin, Metsliakov, eventually stopped caring about his duties and paid little attention to how his charge spent his time or what he was doing. Besides, there was not much to do anyway. Stalin stopped writing and reading. There was nothing to write about. Books were impossible to obtain. During exile, he learned of Malinovsky's betrayal, and it was a devastating blow. Stalin had considered Malinovsky a friend. Perhaps his later obsession with finding traitors was connected to this experience. The traitor turned out to be someone Stalin would never have suspected of such a thing. Far away, World War I was raging, while near Turukhansk, Stalin was quietly fading away. He was approaching 40 years old. At such an age, people begin taking stock of their lives. And there he was, an activist of a weak, nearly defeated party, an exile at the edge of the world, living, frankly speaking, like a vegetable. Even his comrades in the party began to forget about him. In 1915, Lenin reportedly asked his comrades to remind him of Joseph's surname. Do you happen to remember Koba's surname? The future was becoming increasingly uncertain. Stalin was eventually transferred closer to civilization, to Achinsk, but that changed very little. Then, in 1917, something happened that almost nobody truly expected anymore. A revolution broke out in Petrograd. The exiled Bolshevik received a new chance. And what a chance it was. Returning to Petrograd, Stalin found a completely new situation. Biographers often face an understandable temptation. They know who a person eventually became and construct narratives based on that hindsight. Reality, however, usually looks very different. By 1917, Stalin had already lived an entire life, one that was far from being a simple preface to future events. The model student had become a radical youth. The radical youth, a professional revolutionary fighter. The fighter, a politician. And the result was an almost broken man in a distant exile. Stalin entered his new life carrying a complicated burden, and most importantly, there was still a great deal ahead of him. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, write comments, and see you in the next episode.